My talk here is a bit of a downer. I'm mostly going to talk about problems and is the browser doomed and stuff like that. So sorry about that in advance. But I have to say that by doing this, I'm staying within the bounds of a sacred and long-lived web tradition. Back in 1998, Wired magazine first forecast the death of the, oh, you can't see it very well. Kiss your browser goodbye. So people have been forecasting the death of the web for a long, long time, and it's still here. So with any luck, it'll survive my doomsaying as well. So let's go on in that tradition. And I'm also, by the way, going to exercise keynoter's privilege and hijack the last 10 minutes of this talk and talk a little bit about privacy. And security and so on, because I've started to get awfully upset about this stuff and have been working on it. And in the age of Ed Snowden, anybody who is not worried about this stuff probably isn't doing their job. So you will forgive me in advance for going down that track. So there's probably a few too many people here for this to be comfortably interactive. So I'm probably not going to do questions. But here's how it works. I'm going to talk here for a little bit less than an hour. And anybody who wants to go to the party will then go downstairs, and there's buses coming on at the Oak Street entrance, which will take you over to the party. And I will cheerfully drink beer and argue about any of the things I've talked about there at the party for quite some time. So hold your questions and come and let's do them over beer, which is a better way to do that kind of thing anyhow. Okay. And I'm not going to spend my whole time up here talking about, the death of the browser and how we're all doomed and so on, because it's not actually that complicated or controversial. I wanted to actually start up in sort of a cheerful mode and talk about us being in the golden age of server-side software. Because we really are. I said golden age, and I meant it. Things have never been better. I've been doing both server and client-side software for 3 decades or more. And right now, in 2014, we really are in the golden age. Things have never been better, and they are getting better all the time. And a lot of you folks here are too young to remember, although I see quite a few gray hairs out there, so not all of you. Remember that we went through, in our profession, a sort of a decade-and-a-half long period of what I would call the Java nuclear winter. And that was the period when everything to be taken seriously had to be programmed in Java, and all your data to be taken seriously had to be persisted in SQL, which probably meant writing a great big fat check to Larry Ellison. And it was, a lot of good software was built, but it was really sort of a painful experience. Jeepers, who is that guy? Is he a hip young programmer or a street person they hauled in for this shoot? And what on earth is that computer? I think they photoshopped his computer to make it look bigger. Anyhow, I guess you have to be hip to program Java these days. And so things are really immensely getting better. Let's be honest, even Java is getting better, around the margins. It's still an overly ceremonious language that is verbose and rigid in places that make you uncomfortable. But, they do work at it, and they whittle away, and the JVM is a fantastic piece of work and gets better. But these days, the really important thing is that when you're going to build some server-side software, you have a lot of choices. You can there's things like PHP, of course, and we all like to sneer at PHP. Well, I do anyhow. But we should be exercising humility, because whatever you may think of PHP, we should bear in mind that Facebook and WordPress and Wikipedia and things like that are existentially dependent upon PHP. So even if it's not a very good programming language, and no, it's not a very good programming language, that doesn't mean you can't build beautiful things with it. But it's a perfectly plausible choice. You're not going to get fired for choosing. And of course, there's Rails. Rails has moved, from a radical idea to totally in the mainstream, and actually is starting to feel a little bit enterprisey and boring these days, surely they could come up with a better slogan than web development that doesn't hurt. I would hope that we could ask for more than that. And of course, Django has never been more than a minority religion, but it's still a strong minority religion, and it's awfully good software, actually. And these days, Node, of course, Node is definitely the new hotness. And I'd have to say that I don't think I've ever seen a technology come out of the weeds and into the mainstream quite as fast in all my years of programming as I've seen with Node. And you're totally not going to get fired for using Node these days. Lots of very, very mainstream operations are using it, and by and large, it seems to really be a pretty nice piece of gear. And this is the stuff that's mainstream, and there's all sorts of interesting stuff emerging from out of the mainstream as well. But before I talk about that, let's talk about why it's actually easier to be good on the server side than on the client side. If you're building server-side software, the environment in which you're developing is a fairly small API surface. You have to deal with the operating system stuff, files and processes and things like that, which I'm representing with Tux. And you have to do some persistence, and whether that's SQL or post-relational. And of course, you have to deal with the actual web server connections, which I'm representing with the Apache Feather. And the effect is that those of us who write server-side software, most of the code we actually write is application code dealing with application objects, doing application work. It's app-level programming. It also has the characteristic that reality is mostly composed of requests coming in, which are mostly text, and results coming out, which are mostly text, which means that by its very nature, this kind of stuff is nicely sandboxable, nicely mockable, and very, very nicely unit testable. So by and large, you can have an excellent culture of unit testing around server-side software without actually working too hard. When you're building client-side software, say in a native mobile app, your API surface is immensely huger. You have the same old stuff. You've got an operating system to deal with and a persistence layer, which universally seems to be SQLite, and of course the web stuff that you're going to have to talk to. But you've also got a microphone in the thing, and some speakers, and telephony, and a compass, and a GPS, and 3 or 4 different radios, and a vibrator. That you have. Wait a second, you're laughing. You think I'm kidding? There's the vibrator API right there that you have to deal with. And the typical logic that you write in that kind of an app is nothing to do with business objects, nothing to do with business flows. What happens is you get poked by some API saying the user touched this or moved that, and you adjust a couple of variables, and you branch off to another area of that huge API surface to achieve the result you want. And one of the effects of that is that unit testing is brutally, horribly difficult, and is by and large not done. I know there are exceptions, but speaking only for myself, I ship software on both sides, and over the last few years, I don't think I've published any server-side software that didn't come with a pretty serious attempt at good unit test coverage. I'm not going to claim to be a pure TDD bigot, but I really do firmly believe in unit testing, as should we all, and apply it as much as possible. And I will freely confess that I have not shipped any mobile software that has any significant unit test coverage because it's just too bloody difficult. Those slides come out of a blog post I wrote a little while ago called Type System Criteria, which examines these issues and deduces, see there's those pictures, deduces that for apps in which there is a large API surface and mobile and unit testing is therefore difficult, there is a strong indication in those environments using statically typed languages is a win, whereas on the server side, where you have a small API surface and it's really easy to write unit testing, it's much more plausible to get away with dynamically typed languages like your JavaScript, Ruby, and Python. But that's another speech at another conference. But I think it's actually true. Okay, let's move on here. So the other nice thing that's going on in the server-side language, server-side, is that we are really starting to make leaps and bounds in our progress on dealing with concurrency. And concurrency is where you have to go if you care about performance, and everybody cares about performance. Moore's law still works, but computers don't get any faster, they just get wider. And I remember when I went to college, the functional programming unit in the 4th level software course, broke everybody's mind and made them confused and feel stupid, and you couldn't understand why a person would want to think about computer programming that way. And these days, we all are going to have to start to learn how to think in functional programming terms if we are going to get any sort of decent performance. And the world kind of discovered Erlang just a few years ago, and Erlang, although it's very weird, has taught us a lot of things. Here's some Erlang code. Oh, it's way too small to read. Never mind. Here's some Erlang code that increments a counter. And it takes, a dozen lines of Erlang code to implement something that increments a counter where I'll add 1 to something and then report the count. And however, you could have 100,000 of these things operating in parallel, and you'd never get a race condition or any of the other horrible things that can happen with concurrency because you don't have any shared mutable state. And Erlang just knows how to do this stuff in the best possible way. Now, let me get back to my notes here. I don't actually think, however, that Erlang is going to sweep the world and become, the mainstream tool that everybody uses to build their software. It's just a little too weird. It doesn't have variables, and it doesn't have types really, or classes, or objects, or any of that other kind of stuff that we've liked. But despite that, it taught us a huge number of important lessons about how to think about concurrency and stuff. And let's not sneer at Erlang. It was a significant part of the WhatsApp software suite that Facebook just spent, I can't even say that number, for, and it's obviously serious stuff. And for those of us who kind of like Erlang and wish it were a little more friendly, what you really want to do is to come see Dave Thomas's talk tomorrow, where he's going to talk about, Dave, are you here? Who's going to talk about Elixir, which is an attempt to take all the good stuff about Erlang, running on the Erlang VM, and add in some more familiar and reassuring language idioms derived largely from Ruby. So keep that in mind. And of course, Erlang's role as sort of the central leader in how to think about concurrency has become taken by Clojure, I think, which is sort of the poster boy for how to think about concurrency in the 2010s. And if you've never been to a talk by Rich Hickey, the guy who did Clojure, you should. He's a tremendously compelling speaker and has thought about this more than anybody else. And it takes sort of Erlang-like ideas about concurrency and combines them with a lot of other thinking that's come along since then and gives you more or less exactly what you need to write very, very fast, highly concurrent software without staying out of trouble. Having said that, I also don't think Clojure is going to take over the world. And the reason is that Clojure is a Lisp. And whatever you may think about Lisp, and I know many of us are full of wonder at the ineffable magic of Lisp, but if Lisp were going to have taken over the world, it would have by now, and it hasn't, so it's not gonna. And of course, particularly since Martin's coming here tomorrow to talk, I should mention Scala, which has been causing a lot of excitement among people who like static typing and functional programming and the JVM. Scala is moving in fast out of the mainstream and is actually in use at a lot of big production websites. Once again, I have my doubts about whether Scala is going to, I'm 100% sure that Scala has some super important lessons to teach us about how language programming platform should be structured. I have my doubts about how far it'll sweep the world. It's got a lot of syntax, just really a lot of syntax, and I find serious Scala programs hard to read, but I could easily be wrong on this. And then, of course, even going back to the mainstream, Node.js has a really good concurrency story, if only because the implementations are single-threaded and everything's a callback. It's hard to get yourself in concurrency trouble there. So the notions of functional programming and are really becoming mainstream in the server side, which makes it a wonderful time to be alive. But here's a little program I wrote, into which you. It's an API, but it's got a program on the front of it. You give an email address, such as mine, and run it, and it goes, and I'm going to do that again. Oops. Yeah. I'm going to do that again. I could have just hit refresh. Anyhow, and what it does is it goes and tries to find a plausible internet identity provider for that email address by looking in MX records and probing Google and looking at WebFinger and looking at WebFist and applying some heuristics and so on and so forth. And this kind of thing is important in the future of identity systems because it's going to be important to find out whose identity, what identity provider you want to use in a world where there are lots of them. Now, for this to work, it has to try all these things in parallel. So it's, by definition, a highly concurrent problem. And I implemented it in the Go programming language, and that's more or less all the code that matters right here. And I think Go hits a really super important sweet spot. And I don't work for Google anymore. I did up until a couple months ago, but I don't anymore, so I'm no longer under such deep suspicion for being a Go fanboy. But Go hits a huge sweet spot. Here's the code that does that, and I'm going to walk you through it. So what happens here is, in the second, those of you who are at the back and want to see it, move up. Otherwise, just wait 5 minutes and I'll be past this slide. And I think this is the last slide with code on it. So, so what happens is we make a channel in the second line there. A channel is this thing in Go where it's a pipe. It's a pipe, like a Unix-style pipe, only it's typed. You can only send typed variables through it. So we make a channel that has a search result type. And then I say Go timeout. And I need to make this screen a little smaller. And then timeout, here's timeout down there at the bottom. Timeout is just a little routine that waits two seconds and sends a result down the pipe. This arrow here sends a result down the pipe saying, oh, I timed out. 2 seconds have passed. Okay? And so I say Go timeout. And then I say for each of the searchers I've registered, and since Go is a statically typed language with nice interface architecture, I can have anything and call it a searcher as long as it has a method called search on it. And so I'll say search for that email, and here's the channel to send the results on, and here's some housekeeping stuff. And then I go and in my loop here, each time around the loop, I read from the channel. That gives me a search result from somebody. It blocks on it. And then I do some saying, well, if that was a timeout, I give up. Otherwise, if it didn't find any IDPs, don't worry about it. If it got an IDP that's verified and believable, stop waiting for others and break out of the loop and so on. So this gives me an essentially functional programming style of programming without having to really think about all the weird things that things like Erlang and Haskell and so on make you think about. It's a very conventional kind of feeling programming language, but the functional programming idioms are natural enough that people are going to pick them up and start using them effortlessly. And what it reminds me of is the way Java made object orientation palatable to the world. Back before Java came along, there was a lot of people in the computer science community who thought that, object-oriented garbage-collected languages are great for theorists, but ordinary people will never use them. And then Java came along, and it looked like C, and kind of smelled like C, and had a comprehensive library to do everything, and everybody started using it. So I think Go actually has the potential to make functional programming idioms palatable and friendly and change the world. And actually, if you're a functional programming purist, you may be upset because Go is just good enough that it might hit an 80-20 point to make further work on functional programming somewhat less cost effective. Things are good not only on the programming side, things are also wonderful on the data persistence side. We have an embarrassment of riches. And if you still need to use SQL, and sometimes you do, there's a wide selection of excellent, high-quality, free, open-source versions around, so you can do that without having to write a check to Larry Ellison. And I strongly recommend not writing checks to Larry Ellison. But you don't have to use SQL. There are a plethora of really terrific post-relational databases out there that have sort of, over the course of the last decade, crossed the divide from being bleeding-edge experiments to things you can bet your businesses on. Now, Adrian Cockcroft was here this morning talking about this, and at this point, I'd like to refer to this talk he gave a couple of years ago, almost exactly 1 year ago, actually, almost a year ago, talking about Cassandra in particular. And I like to hold Cassandra up as an example of the kind of thing people who think they need SQL should look at. Cassandra shows that you can use post-relational semantics and have absolutely world-class performance, which obviously places like Netflix need. So that's an awfully good talk. I recommend going through it. In particular, the slide about how they moved 18 terabytes across the country in almost no time with almost no work, and it all just worked. And Cassandra is not the only option, and maybe for your problem, not even the best. I started this section by talking about all the choices you have out there. Here's some more. Here's another example. Tricia G. gave a talk earlier today in which she built a non-trivial web application in less than an hour using Groovy and Mongo and Angular. All technologies I haven't even mentioned yet. But choice, choice, choice. We have it. Most of the choices are good. You know, if I'd been doing that thing that Tricia was doing, I probably would have used Go and Cassandra instead of Groovy and MongoDB, but we probably both would have got great results. So for those of you in the room who are not server-side developers, look at the other people and envy them, because their life is just great right now and getting better. But let us turn to the client side and the impending death of the browser, or not. How many of you here write client-side code again? So I'm looking at, maybe 30, 40 hands go up there. So if there's, let's say there's 30 of you, just to make this even. That means that if I want to get client software written down and I have a certain amount of time to do it, I have the equivalent of 10 people to deploy. Why is that? Because I have to write it 3 times. I have to write the browser version, I have to write the Android version, and I have to write the iOS version. And hey, it's getting worse. Windows Phone is coming along, and you might end up having to write everything 4 times instead of 3 times. Wouldn't that be great? I don't see any way around it. There is one group of programmers on the mobile side who figured how to cut that corner. And to illustrate that, I'm going to look at the top-selling games on the Google Play Store for Android. And if you look at the top-selling, in particular the top-grossing, money-grossing games on Android, you will discover that a very high proportion of them are written with a toolkit like Unity or Unreal, and are in fact written in C++. So, for those of us who grappled with for many a year with the whole write once, run anywhere problem, the answer seems to be with us, and the answer seems to be C++. I don't think that's the way the future was supposed to work out, but it sort of has. Now, at this point, when I start moaning the fact that you have to write everything twice, there's at least 5 people in the audience who are just squirming to wave their hands and jump up and say, Apache Cordova, or PhoneGap as it was formerly known, or one of those other things, where you just write it once with JavaScript using modern browser technologies, and you get an app that runs on all those platforms, and everything's just great, and you only have to write it once. Unfortunately, I just don't believe that. Reach out and point and show me the number of apps that have really had a big impact and changed the world, and in fact are written with that kind of mobile web technology. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't embed a web view in your app whenever you want to display text. Nothing wrong with that whatsoever. But you still have to write the app once for iOS and once for Android. It's a great dream, and in fact, it does have a useful role. For people who are doing quickie enterprise apps, inside the enterprise that aren't going to be shown to the world, just to get this done, write an app for our company meeting to gather talk ratings or something like that. Sure, go ahead, use Cordova. You'll get something that won't be very pretty, but it'll be perfectly useful. But if it's something that's going to be part of your public-facing brand, you can't really do it. So how about this whole mobile versus browser apps thing? This really matters. And I can't find the quote, but somebody from Google said in public just the other day that this year, 2014, is going to be the year where the number of queries Google sees from mobile devices exceeds the number they see from desktops. And that's not going to go back down, right? It's going to keep exceeding it by more and more and more. And it's also partly because 2014 is the year that mobile phones exceeds the number of people in the world. So inevitably, we say it's a cliche. We've said it so often that it's become a cliche, but it's really, really, really true that the number of interactions with the internet are going to become increasingly dominated by things that run through mobile devices rather than conventional desktop browsers. And for those, well, the pressure starts to come on to have a mobile app. Because wherever the mobile devices go, they drag the apps behind them. So is the trend away from the browser towards the appification of everything real? Is that really happening? And why? And is it a problem? And if it's a problem, should we do anything about it? And it matters because I'm old enough to remember how much of a boon to the world the arrival of the web was. I can remember back in the day when everything was running on a Visual Basic or Motif or Swing or something like that, custom compiled app for the desktop, and then the web came along in the early mid-90s, and all that stuff was thrown into the dustbin of history in about 15 minutes. Because people really, really liked doing everything through web browsers. Oh, you mean I can do everything I need to do by filling in some forms and pressing submit, and if I get confused, there's always a back button? Why would I ever use a Visual Basic app again? I can remember like yesterday, I was at some document management conference because I was in the business at that point, and this woman from a large computer company got up, and she was in their documentation group saying, oh, it's so great. Now all the content management vendors had to go to web front ends because they had to throw away all that stuff that didn't really matter, and they had to have simple menus with simple options and a submit button. I had a company that I helped found called OpenText at the time. We were a content management company. And we slaughtered the competition for years, even though in many cases they had better products, because we were the first to go to a pure web front end. It greatly improved the quality of life. Now, what happened was, as soon as that happened, and the browser took over from everything else, people started saying, oh, well, that's okay for simple user interfaces, but we really need something more, responsive and immersive and so on for real people. And of course, they were proposing things like Flash or Silverlight or JavaFX, really JavaFX, as a substitute for that. And the ordinary people were just fine living in the browser. And all the JavaFXs and Silverlights and Flashes lost, and the browser won. And that was a good thing for the world up until about 2010. And about 2010, mobile apps really started to push onto the center of the stage and push everything else sideways. And at the moment, a very high proportion of the IT management community really truly believes that they need to have a mobile app. They absolutely believe they need to have a mobile. It doesn't matter what their website is. They have to have a mobile app, or they're not doing it right. And this gives me my chance, like 20 minutes into my talk, to use my first XKCD cartoon. Fortunately, there is a certain amount of popular pushback of people who recognize, the many virtues of mobile apps and do not want the entire internet to vanish into the Apple App Store and the Google Play Store. In fact, we have an adult audience here, so this is a famous Tumblr. It's having a not safe for work URL is stylish, I say, which has many examples of people who want you to download apps, and we're in the places where you really wouldn't want to do that. Right. And if you want a more serious take on this, Jeff Atwood, the Stack Overflow guy, wrote a really outstanding piece on this called Apocalypse Now, worrying about, he hit the same XKCD cartoon, worrying about this. So it is clearly the case that a certain amount of the drive towards having a native mobile app for everything is a function of pointy-haired bosses, but not all of it. There are just a lot of things that you can do in a mobile app, native mobile app, easily and straightforwardly that are awkward and stupid and slow. And I have to confess, a lot of the things that I do on my mobile device are apps that could have been websites, but they're better as apps. Let's not fight history when history is against us. One of the reasons for this is the quality of the developer experience. If I want to, in an app, have a scrolling list of things that, where the one that's in focus displays a nice image, and when I touch it, it flips sideways or something like that. Well, yeah, I can do that in a browser. I can do that in 26 different libraries, and I have to pick which one I want to use. If I'm writing an iOS app or an Android app, there's one canonical way to do that. You go and use this API and the app framework, and it does what you want, and it just works. And there's an IDE and a debugger and a profiler and an analyzer, and it's all set up for you. I mean, here's a picture I made once of the Android app ecosystem and what it looks like. And it's a nice logical picture. And Cocoa Touch, the iOS stack, is just as good. But the HTML5 advocates jump up and say, but we're working hard on this, and we can produce experiences that look just like native apps, and they can use the GPS and detect movement and things like that. And yeah, okay, I guess that's sort of fair. But let's not forget that this and the iOS are both being built ferociously hard by elite engineering terms. For 2 years, I sat next to and worked with the Android core engineering team, and I've never met a better engineering team in my life. These are not wet behind the ears kids. These are people who helped build, things like BOS and Motif and Amiga and all sorts of stuff, and they really deeply understand the issues of what programmers need and what users want in a graphical user interface. And they have, in each case, produced, I would say, superb GUI development toolkits. So, it's not as though HTML5's competition is standing still. I've learned over my years in the industry that one of the chief things that you can use to predict which way development is going to go is follow the developers. If you make something easy and pleasant for developers to do, that's what's going to happen. And I got to say, these days, building Android and iOS apps is pretty easy. But, nonetheless, HTML5 rocks. It's even got a URL saying HTML5 rocks, so, it must rock. And there's a huge amount of work being done out there, cross-platform code, native-like experiences, and so on and so on and so on. And look at all the stuff that's being built on top of it. There's jQuery, which sort of become the assembler level, the lowest level to which anybody programs JavaScript anymore. And Sass for your CSS or less, if you prefer that. And, there's Angular, so you can have an MVC right there in your JavaScript. Or, you can have Ember, which is Angular's competition, and you have to have a PhD to understand which is better. And then there's Backbone to do, well, I've never actually figured out what Backbone does, but it's important. And, if you want the ultimate importance, there's ASM performance, there's ASM.js. And if you want Google's take on what the ultimate performance is going to be, you switch into Dart. And then, of course, there's Bootstrap, since, everybody finally decided to stop fighting with CSS and they just wanted a grid model. And by the way, I've done Bootstrap a lot, but Bootstrap, the first 80% is easy, and I find myself then fighting with Bootstrap a lot. And these days, there's things that give you the grid paradigm of Bootstrap without all the extra stuff. And two that are really getting my attention lately are neat.bourbon.io and zengrids.com, both of which are Sass-based. And I'm predisposed to like them because Sass uses Ruby, and I like Ruby. But the whole notion of having grid-based layouts is entering the mainstream. And so you look at all this energy and all these super advanced frameworks that are being built on top of the browser architecture, and you think, wow, this is wonderful. This must be the place to be. And it is wonderful. It's certainly energetic, but oh, pardon me, I forgot some more stuff. Polymer, right? Brick. Yeah. But what it reminds me of is this. It reminds me of the Cambrian Explosion. When evolution went crazy a few 100 million years ago and produced all these strange, weird, bizarre things, including this famous creature, which has 7 eyes and 11 legs and a long nose and so on and so forth. And evolution went crazy and shot off in all directions. And I guess it was a wonderful time to be alive, particularly if you were one of those. But in fact, most of those turned out to be dead ends. And usually, when you observe a technology that's charging off in all directions at once with a whole bunch of engineering victories, all of which are incompatible with each other, the conclusion you want to take away is that, well, maybe there's something simpler there under the hood waiting to be discovered. Now, that's not to say the Cambrian explosions are bad. In fact, that brief burst of evolutionary creativity, well, brief, it was only like tens of millions of years long, produced directions that led to, among other things, us. So, it's not entirely a wasted effort. But I have to say that I am kind of dubious. And I think that the browser programming platform has become a confusing place to be. Which libraries are you going to use? It's hard to choose, and people have, strong religious feelings about which are better. And one of the ways that if you care about the browser and you want to bring back its values would be to try and accelerate the evolutionary process and converge on a smaller number of options to do, the things we want to do. And of course, that's tough because it means somebody's stuff gets sent to the graveyard. Here's a thing that I posted on Reddit, and this was a really smart comment somebody made. I'm going to read it to you. So I recently worked on a 6-month-long project with 3 other developers and they were going to building out an internal data analytics tool that would let non-technical folks slice and dice data. And they assumed that the server-side piece would be where they spent their time, but it was actually trivial. They had S3 and Scribe and Hadoop and Postgres and Redis and configure it with Chef and run it all in AWS, and it all turned out to be easy and more or less just work. On the client side, they had to learn JavaScript and jQuery, but have some really strange quirks, and they had to learn CSS and Sass, and no, you can't just do height 100% Y. Well, yes, it is strange that your div is behind your other div, even though it's got a higher Z index, and you need to clear fix that outer div to fix all the way the things are floating each other. Well, what's a clear fix? Well, everybody knows that. And there's Backbone and Marionette to make Backbone better, and require.js because JavaScript doesn't have a linker. You need to package and minimize this stuff together, and it's tough. It really is. And if we're going to if we are going to make things better, we need to simplify and converge a little bit. And frankly, we need to start building on a better base because, well, okay, I just can't get past this here. Here is a little console on which I'm going to run node, and I'm going to make an array, I don't know, and I'm going to sort it. Yeah, JavaScript. Sorry. Anyhow, it gave me the right answer even though it, okay. Okay, there's an excuse for that, but why should I have to make excuses for my programming languages? I just have a really grave doubt in my mind as to whether JavaScript is a satisfactory base on which to build the client architectures of the future. I know lots of people are doing wonderful work in it, but I feel like they're sort of fighting with one hand tied behind their back. Here's a tweet I tweeted not that long ago. My browser size seems to have gone crazy. No Twitter, I don't want to sign in. So a modern browser addresses its data with URLs and talks to the network with HTTP and displays text with HTML and styles it with CSS. And the fundamental API is the DOM API, and it uses JavaScript to write code in. And some of those things are good, and some of those things are not so good. And in fact, all that other stuff I talked about basically are workarounds. We wouldn't need all that explosion of creativity that's going on if we already had a grid-based style sheet model. Or if we had an API more like jQuery and less like DOM. Or if we had a more modern and well-thought-out language in JavaScript. So that's the kind of thing that makes me pessimistic at a deep level about the future of the browser. That feels to me like building castles on sand. And, as Gregor Rothfuss famously said, vertically and horizontally centering a div with CSS is the hardest problem in computer science. And, that's kind of true. So, what are we going to do about this? I don't know. But, I think we should do something. Because if I'm right, and the combination of management motives and technical choices drives the browser into a niche role, that's bad. It's a problem. Here's why. Because the browser has two super important characteristics that I think matter a lot, and I'm very, very reluctant to lose. The first is that if I want to do something on the internet, there's a well-known right way to discover something and do it on the internet, which is you put your cursor in that little search window at the top of your browser, and you say, how do I, whatever. And you get a result list that probably has a very good answer near the top. And you click on it, and it takes you to the app, and you do whatever, right there in your browser. It's a top-level citizen of the internet. If it turns out you need to use a mobile app, well, hey, then you're off into the App Store. And you're not in the universe of what anybody can put on the internet. You're in the universe of what Apple thinks it's appropriate to sell you. If you're in Android, it's a little less painful because the Google Play Store isn't a monopoly, and you might find another app that's outside the Play Store. But, the Play Stores are pretty good these days, but they're a pale shadow of what you can get on the internet. I think It's very, very important that the solutions we use be top-level citizens of the internet, and web apps are and mobile apps are not. And I think that's a big deal and it matters. I hate the notion that the apps I'm allowed to use are curated by somebody else. You know, that's not what the internet is supposed to be. The other problem is that actual web apps are deeply better than native mobile apps because you can update them right then in real time. You know, if I've got a problem, I can update my code, and the next person to hit the site gets the new app. If I'm on an iOS app, I'm looking at a delay of weeks, potentially, days at best, to get my updated code out there. Android is probably only hours, but it's still not good. You know, do you have a data-losing, privacy-leaking, low-security, password-leaking bug in your mobile app? Well, sucks to be you. You know, I think that's a big problem. So I really want us to get back to a state somehow where we can have the important virtues of the web app. How are you going to do that? I mean, the app stores are okay, but they're too slow and too commercial and ugh. So how are we going to get there? Well, we need to fix those red patches, right? I think the only way we're going to save the browser at the end of the day is to fix that problem. Have a browser with a first-class native grid-oriented style sheet, a first-class native API, something like jQuery, selector-based, a good programming language, probably statically typed because, you know, the API surface is so huge inside the browser, with a good debugger, a good IDE, a good profiler. Who could do that? Google could do that. Google should do that. One of the last things I did before I left Google was tell them to do that. I don't know if they will. But I think if that doesn't happen, we're going to be forced into a niche. What is the niche for the browser? Well, news. I don't know. Publications. People say, well, if your app is really a publication, you just do a browser app. Well, I don't buy that. You know, I use the BBC app and the Economist app and lots of apps like that. Lots of the best news sources are inside apps these days, and that's crazy. They shouldn't have to be. They should be web apps. So there's a problem there. In the short term, you know, you might want to make sure you have some mobile native app building competency because, guys, ladies and gentlemen, that's the way that the world's moving, whether you like it or not. I don't like the way it's moving, but that's the way it's moving. Let's try and push back. Okay, enough about that. All right. So I have a little bit more time. Okay. Let me spend the last few minutes of my speech talking about something entirely different. Let's talk about privacy. Hey, Ed. No, I didn't. Anyhow, we've all met Ed, right?
What are some of the concerns?
And this is such an incredibly polarizing subject. I've noticed that, you know, the people who think Ed Snowden is a hero and people who think he's a traitor, it's not that they just disagree, they're not even talking the same languages. You know, they have no basis. Wait, listen, Ed Snowden's a hero. Hands? Okay. Ed Snowden's a traitor. One? Two? Couple? Okay, fair enough. The people, you know, these people are sitting on the opposite sides of a gulf and don't even have language to talk to each other. I think it's a problem. I'm clearly in the hero camp on this. Who's watching you? Who is actually watching you? So it turns out that the people who are watching you sort nicely into 4 buckets. The first group of people who are watching you on the web are the monetizers. Google, Facebook, Twitter, that kind of thing. They want to know everything you do so they can figure out how to sell a better ad. Easy to understand. The second group is, of course, what I will refer to as over-enthusiastic public servants, you know, the NSA and their friends, your own government watching you. Third group that's watching you is foreign governments. Most people don't have to worry about that because, you know, if you work for Google, you do, or if you work for a national security job, you do, but it is absolutely the case that foreign spies are out there looking at you. And the fourth group that's watching you are, of course, crooks, people who are trying to steal your identity, steal your money. We often talk about crooks in this sort of abstract sense, but they're not abstract at all, they're real. Here they are. Meet them. Buyaccess.com. This is a website in Russian where you can buy stolen accounts. There's the stolen accounts, the number that are for sale, the price per 1,000, $5 a 1,000 for stolen mail.ru accounts, $15 for rambler.ru. MySpace, wow, there's still MySpace? But look, they're more expensive. They're $100 an account. Where's Gmail? There's no Gmail here? Usually. Oh, there it is. Yeah, Gmail, the people who actually have good security groups, you can tell because the numbers of accounts are lower and the prices are higher. So don't kid yourself. There are bad guys out there watching you all the time. But it's easy to understand. For the crooks and for the foreign governments, they are there to be resisted. We should do our best to resist them with the tools at our disposal. When it comes to the monetizers, well, that's an issue for politics, really. There's no consensus. A lot of people like having free services and don't mind having ads pay for them. Other people are just horrified at the idea that Gmail reads all your mail to what ads to sell you. And this is frankly a job for politics, which is perfectly okay because that's what politics is for. Making those kind of rules. And that leads us with the spooks, with the government agencies who want to watch us. What can they do? Well, they can put boxes at the big internet exchanges and run pipes from the routers, capturing all the data that goes through, and they do. They can use FISA. I don't know what that stands for, but it's a particular court that issues national security warrants. They can use FISA to make your telephone company tell them everywhere you go, and they do. They can use FISA to make your ISP give them all your traffic, and they do. They can use FISA to make your email provider give them all your email, and they do. They can use FISA to make the sites you visit disclose what you do when you're there, and they do. And they can use FISA to make your IDP disclose where you've been signing into and with what identities, and they do that too. But is that really a problem? I mean, these are public servants. They're just trying to protect you. There's lots of bad people out there trying to do bad things, terrorists, criminals. And protecting you is important. They're not in it for the money. And anyhow, if you don't have anything to hide, why would you want privacy? I hate that. I hear that all the time, and I hate that line of argument, and I think it's deeply, deeply, deeply wrong. And I think we should all be equipped to push back against it. So here are some of the reasons why that's just a complete load of bullshit. First of all, the people, the public servants who are spying on us, at the end of the day, they're just people. Most of them are sane, honest, prudent public servants who are underpaid, working too hard. But they're just people. A small proportion of them are crooks, or crazy, or stupid, or just nasty. This is inevitable. It's in the nature of the human beast. And they have a huge amount of power. They can arrange that you go to secondary processing every time you go to an airport. They can have a malign influence on which of your research requests get funded. They can keep you from getting a job that requires a security clearance or any other background check. So people who go off the rails in this profession can screw up the world. And another problem is that I've known a lot of law enforcement and actually intelligence people over the years, and that culture has an unfortunate tendency towards tribalism. People tend to think that, well, you're either in it or against us. And we see it time and time again in every society, even the most civilized societies where a public servant is caught, a law enforcement officer, a policeman, or a spy is caught doing something wrong, and they close ranks. And their first loyalty seems to be to each other. And history has shown that this can go completely off the rails and lead to the overthrows of governments and the instatement of dictatorships. So there's a cultural problem there, and we need to respect our law enforcement people, pay them well, and regulate the hell out of them and not trust them. We have to do all those things at the same time. It's tough, but that's what we have to do. The other thing is, one of the favorite techniques that the spooks use is putting backdoors on networking equipment and pipe and wires and routers and so on, so they can see what's going on. Well, let me tell you something. There's no such thing as a one-way backdoor. If they can use it, The bad guys, those guys who run those Russian websites, can use it too. And I know, we all know, that the guys, really bad crooks out there, know that the spooks are going around putting backdoors and things, and they're following them around looking for the backdoors the spooks put in. It is just not a reasonable thing to do to globally weaken everybody's security. There's also the incredibly orders of magnitude out of whack cost effectiveness of it. How dangerous is terrorism as a problem in real life? How many people have died as a result of that as opposed to, for example, distracted driving or smoking or alcoholism or all the other things that can go wrong, the many other preventable things. The amount of money and the loss of liberty and the intrusiveness of what we're undergoing to attack what at the end of the day is, relatively speaking, not that big a problem. Makes no sense on a financial basis. And the last point I want to make is the most important one. Privacy is not important as a means to an end. Privacy is a virtue. It's one of the things that we've won for ourselves by virtue of being civilized. We're civilized. We don't have to walk down to the river to bring water. We don't have to poop in a ditch. We don't have to live in a little village where everybody knows how good our sex life and our digestion is. We are civilized people. We have houses with doors that close, and when we close our door, we can do whatever we want behind it, as long as it's not actively endangering other people. And that is something that didn't come automatically. It's something we chose as a civilization to build. Privacy is a virtue in and of itself. It's a pleasant thing to have. Not to have privacy is unpleasant, and huge amounts of good social science studies have proven that people behave differently when they think they're being watched. The notion that you're being watched is something that decreases the quality of your life. So if you're out there defending privacy, you don't have to say, we need privacy because of this other effect it produces. We need privacy because privacy is good. We got it by being civilized. Let's not give it up. So if you, like me, believe that people have an entitlement to a certain amount of privacy when they use the net. Okay, let's assume that everybody here in the room is building an app, or it wouldn't be at this conference, right? Everybody in this room has an app, whether it's a website or a mobile app or whatever. How many of you are confident that your app will work using only HTTPS? I see a few hands go up. Okay, I love you guys. You guys are the future. If you are not confident that your app will work properly using HTTPS, you have a problem. Because if you're trying to make a judgment call based on, well, I'll just use HTTPS for the stuff that's sensitive or private or controversial, how much chance do you have of making that correctly? How many ways are there for you to be wrong? Worse, if you're asking end users to choose between private and non-private modes of communication, they don't have the information needed to make that kind of a choice. You're asking them to make a choice that they just don't know how. The consequence of a negative failure, which is a positive failure, which is, well, you gave them some privacy when they really didn't need it, is pretty mild. But the consequence of a negative failure, where they needed privacy and you didn't give it to them, is horrifying. In particular, if the app that you are building offers services to people who are children or downtrodden or seriously disadvantaged in life, you really ought to be offering them privacy. It might make my blood run cold. There's people offering apps that work for elementary kids that don't use HTTPS. So Joe Bad Guy parks his car outside the elementary school, uses Firesheep, and he's got personal identifying information on every child in that school. That's shocking. Particularly if you are running an app that is public-facing and used by a large number of consumers, and you are not supporting HTTPS today, you're in a bad place. You're in a bad place morally and ethically, and you could be in a bad place legally if it's discovered that somebody's life is really screwed up because somebody watched what they were doing on Firesheep and saw what you were doing. So, as to start with, step 0. Support HTTPS. Start doing it today. It doesn't cost that much. It's not that hard. Yeah, it's a little extra bureaucracy, and it's a few $100 a year for certs and so on. But, do it. You owe it to the people who use your stuff. By the way, just last week, or 2 weeks ago maybe, IATF published RFC 7258. IATF is the Internet Engineering Task Force. This is an official finding on the behalf of the people who build the Internet protocols that the kind of pervasive monitoring that we know is going on is an attack. And that the designers of all future Internet protocols are required to show that their design has taken pervasive monitoring into account and has things in place to mitigate it. So I don't think your responsibility is any less. So you need to, at the very minimum, support HTTPS. Then you need to think very carefully about what data is being persisted in your app that belongs to other people. And you need to be explicitly clear about what you're saving, why you're saving it, what your stance is as regards public servants who come in with warrants, where your hosting is, what regulations cover your hosting, under what circumstances you share the data with anybody else. This has kind of been a luxury up till now, but it's not anymore. Okay, so I've stood up here for like an hour and said negative, gloomy things, but you know, life's actually pretty good. We get to work on software on the internet. It's fun. It's interesting. It's well paid. You know, anybody who's willing to work at all and take the training can get a pretty decent job. We're qualitatively improving humanity's experience with the world. Our tools are getting better all the time. The networks are getting better all the time. We have the chance to, if you care about this kind of thing, and you should, we have the chance to apply mobile internet technology to lift another few billion people up out of poverty. Be a big piece of that. We have the chance to encourage democracy, encourage prosperity, encourage peace, make the world a better place. And you know, if you're in this profession and you can't say that you've helped do any of those things, well, you only have yourself to blame. You know, we're in a uniquely privileged, uniquely advantaged lot. We have more leverage over the course of history than just about any group has ever had. So take advantage of it. Build something great. Have fun. Thank you.